all you New Yorkers.
Okay, great. Howard, thank you for coming in today on the nice Friday afternoon. I was interested by your tagline, the guardian of real estate rights. Great tagline. Have you always wanted to be a lawyer from a young age, or?
Well, yes, and thank you both, Mitch and Brian, for having me here today. It's great to be here on the Broker Brunch. And yes, as I was trying to figure out a way to distinguish myself from all of the other lawyers who do what I do, I decided to call myself the guardian of real estate rights. I had wanted to be a lawyer since certainly by the time I got to college. I knew that's what I wanted to do, and not just because going to law school was a good way to avoid getting a real job, but I've always been interested in how people can solve the problems that they have interacting with each other. And law is really kind of the architecture of society. And to be able to work in that area has given me great satisfaction.
So your specialty is you handle disputes between any parties in a real estate transaction.
Yeah, I basically offer my clients three things as the guardian of their real estate rights. I litigate aggressively, I negotiate relentlessly, and I advise thoughtfully. And the kind of disputes that I get into are landlord-tenant disputes, lender-borrower disputes, construction disputes, disputes amongst owners. Sometimes I call those partnership disputes, and disputes over contracts, buy-sell, but they can be other contracts as well.
So you have a lot of lengthy, complex negotiations, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. Look, here's the reality. Most cases that end up in court, I think the last number I saw, maybe it's not right, is 97% of business cases end up settling, or more accurately, resolving before a trial happens. They can often be resolved on motions. But yeah, discussions and settling are always something I like to explore because ultimately it probably saves the client not only money in legal fees, but most clients want to do business. They didn't get into real estate or lending money or being a tenant so that they could spend their time trying to figure out how to do best in a dispute. They want to do their business, and what I can offer my clients is the ability to do that. Then they can get back to buying and selling, which is what you guys like to do.
Yeah. New York's a very litigious place, so I imagine there's a lot of business for you.
No shortage of work.
Yeah, there's no shortage of work, and what's driving a lot of it these days are changes in the economy. We all have been through sort of COVID, the work from home movement, the rising interest rates. Before that, there was the Great Recession and coming out of it. And what happens is people go into business often with a set of expectations. Interest rates are going to be X. I'll be able to refinance at Y. I'll always be able to keep my restaurant open to serve my customers. And then those expectations change. And when the parties haven't planned for that, through no fault of their own, because none of this could be predicted, then disputes arise. And that's when they need lawyers to help them get solutions.
Interesting.
When you're going into a dispute, is there a particular framework that you use to start off the conversation?
I would say, I want to find out what happened, and I want to learn as much about what led up to it, who the players are, what everybody's objective is. Sometimes disputes arise because people's objectives are a little bit more hidden. If somebody isn't closing on a contract, is that because they don't have the money? Is that because because they didn't get financing? Is that because they are looking to renegotiate the deal? Understanding that can often help to get to resolution.
And there's always two reasons, I feel like. There's the reason that sounds good, and then there's the real reason.
Well, I don't know if that is always the case, but in a lot of cases it is. New York City is a litigious place, and there are people who are, very clever. And sometimes the reason that's put out for public consumption is not the real underlying reason. And to be able to understand what's really driving the other side's position helps me formulate the best strategy.
What are some tactics you use to get to the root of the issue?
I try to do research to figure out what might be going on here. I question my clients carefully, and I listen. If you listen carefully with empathy, you can often, the other side will often reveal what's really bothering them. A wise man once told me that God gave you two ears and one mouth to remind you to listen twice as hard as you talk.
Yeah. My grandmother told me, so words going around.
Well, I'm wondering why New York is such a litigious place. Like when we went for coffee last week, we were talking about the cultural differences between the UK and New York and America in general. And it's interesting because there's so many entrepreneurial people here and a lot of opportunity. But I'm wondering why it's a litigious place.
Well, maybe it's something in the water, but I think the more likely advantage or more likely reason is, people come to New York. It's a town without a memory. It's a town that, everybody comes to. There are other cities in America where, if your grandparents weren't born there, you really can't break in. In New York City, that's not the case. Anybody with the drive and ambition and a modicum amount of talent can really do things here. And, people want to be the best in the world. And sometimes that leads to litigation.
That's why we're here. And that's why we love it.
Competing interests.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, you guys as brokers get to work with people who are very ambitious, very creative.
Yes.
You help them build their real estate empire. I protect the castle once you guys put it up.
Nice. So you have been working in New York City for how long?
I have been working in New York City for 35 years.
35.
Congrats. I saw on yesterday on LinkedIn a 24-year anniversary at this company.
Yes. My law firm is Meister Silligan Fine. When I started there, and I was just thinking about this today, I think we had about 10 lawyers. Now we have, I believe, between 75 and 80.
Wow.
And 24 years with my partners and my colleagues, all of whom were great people. It's really been very satisfying.
And I know you're passionate about mentorship.
Yes. One of the things that I like to do is try to help the younger or more junior lawyers that we have in our office, sort of understand the ropes. And I like to work with people in business to give them my insights where I can to help them learn about some of the legal things. And of course, I always like to that's kind of a two-way street because I always learn stuff from the business people I work with.
Yeah, we learn from everyone all the time.
So there's a couple of topics that I think are fairly topical right now. One of them that you may be able to provide good insight on is office building foreclosures. And it seems like a ton of office in this city and across the country is now worth less than the debt that was given on the property. What are you seeing on your side of things?
Well, as you probably know, more and more office buildings are, falling into default, missing payments, and generally being sent out to special servicers, and that is going to be an issue. How that gets resolved remains to be seen. I see two real paths there. And before I get to that, let's talk about what happened. In the period from about 2014 to 2017, there was a rising market. A lot of people were owning or purchasing or refinancing buildings, and they did that on a pro forma, which had expected revenues in the future. And that was based on the idea that they could rent the office space and that there would be increasing demand for it. The pandemic happened, work from home happened, and there is now less demand for that space. Plus, we have rising interest rates. So we're now in an environment where the plan was, when we get to our loan coming due, we'll just refinance it. That plan is now completely upside down. The only way you're going to do that, frankly, is to put in a lot of equity, which people are obviously reluctant to do. So that's the problem. How do you solve it? It really depends on what kind of lender who currently owns your loan. There are lenders out there who are the more traditional bank-like institutions. And I think, and this is just my prediction, that they are going to want to work with their borrowers in order to reach some kind of accommodation. There's going to be litigation surrounding that workout probably, but ultimately in those kind of situations, the big open secret is the lender probably doesn't want to take the property back in foreclosure either, for two reasons. One, the lender is an expert in lending money, not an expert in operating a property. I mean, it's not just about internal rate of return. You need to actually rent the units. You need to make sure the lights are on. You need to fix the roof when it starts to leak. Most lenders aren't equipped to do that and don't want to. The other reason is with mark-to-market, once this is an accounting problem, once this hits the balance sheet, that's going to be, a write-down that lender's going to have to take that they don't want to. So that's one track. The other track is where, investors saw an opportunity where they recognized that a property had too much debt on it. They purchased the debt, maybe at a discount, maybe at par, and they effectively loan to own, which, sounds bad, but is part of capitalism. There are parties out there who, have notes that aren't performing or may not be performing. They want to get them off their books. The way you do that in a capitalist society is you have the opportunity to sell that debt. One of the great inventions of Anglo-American law, that you can sell a debt. The people come in and they want to buy it. And this is a way, through a note sale, to ultimately obtain possession of the property. That will be the subject of a long and difficult legal process because the foreclosure system in New York State is cumbersome. And in the downstate counties, like the 5 boroughs, it can take over a year, sometimes longer, to successfully complete a mortgage foreclosure.
Wow. It's going to be interesting how it all plays out.
Yeah, what you see a lot of in buildings with debt stacks is mezzanine foreclosures, which move on a much faster track.
Okay.
We can talk about mezz debt if you'd like.
Interesting.
We got time. Let's
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's mezzanine debt? The mezzanine debt effectively is you lend money to a building owner after the first mortgage. So it's another way of financing your purchase. But rather than taking a security interest in the real property itself, which would be a second mortgage, you take a pledge of the membership interest in the company that owns the property. So it's one level up. Why would anybody create such a convoluted system? Well, the short answer is you don't have to pay mortgage recording tax if you do it that way.
Okay.
There are other reasons, one of which is that you don't have to go through a mortgage foreclosure process. When you do that, you do what is sometimes called a strict foreclosure under the Uniform Commercial Code, where you basically set up an auction of the mezzanine debt.
Mm-hmm.
And the lender has, just like in a regular mortgage foreclosure, the right to credit bid the total amount of the debt. So taking an example, I'll make it simple. If there's $10 million of debt out there and the lender isn't collecting it, they go to the auction with a $10 million head start, in the sense that they can bid in the full amount of their debt, $10 million, and they don't have to write a check at the end of the day.
And it's not actual real dollars. Right?
It's not actual
it's
real dollars.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody else is out there and sees that this property is being auctioned and think that it can be valuable, that interest, they could bid, $10 million and $1, and then they would have to write a check for the full $10 million and $1. The first $10 million would go to take out the mezz lender. They would be made whole, and this competing bidder would then take the debt. The thing to remember in a mezz debt scenario is that the party who is scheduling the auction must sell the property on reasonable terms. And in this business, we know how to do that. You hire an auctioneer, you hire a broker like yourselves, you set up a data room, and you go through the procedures. They'll almost certainly, if the borrower wants to fight, will run into court and say, Judge, the auction procedures are unreasonable, and they'll have a reason. And those happen on a fast track because these auctions are scheduled 30 to 60 days out. Then the judge will make a decision whether or not the auction is really reasonable or not. At this point, most people who are in this space know what they have to do in order to check the box to make sure it's reasonable. You got to give them enough time. You got to make sure that there's an opportunity to be there. That often in this day and age includes present by the internet on Zoom. Again, you have to have a broker. You have to have a data room that everybody has access to. You have to have a professional auctioneer. But once you check all those boxes, you're likely going to be able to auction off that debt.
We're starting to see a bit of that. We just got hired by a lender to sell a stall construction site in the Bronx.
Oh,
They
okay.
did credit bit, they bought it back.
This is a live example.
Yeah, exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing more and more of those, and that doesn't become a legal process, unlike a foreclosure, which is from day one you have to get a judge involved, and it's the foreclosing party who brings the claim. In the mezz debt scenario, you create a notice of sale, and when the borrower is unhappy, they'll be the one who starts the legal process, which will be a complaint, which basically says, Judge, the sale is unreasonable. We shouldn't have to, maybe they say we shouldn't have to pay back their debt for whatever reason. And Judge, you should enjoin this auction. And that's usually how they go down.
The finance world and the capital stack is a murky world. It's all mysterious to me. It's all interesting. Numbers on papers and.
Well, yeah, it is interesting, and the people have gotten very creative in how they create capital stacks.
It provides opportunity for that sort of thing.
It provides
for smart people. The more people smarter than me.
It provides all kinds of investment opportunities. I suppose the biggest example of the gargantuan capital stack was Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, which was the subject of a lot of litigation in various contexts. And one of the things you can learn, and this is in the public record by reading the file, is that debt stack was not only enormous because there was so much, there was a huge acquisition, but it had all kinds of different levels.
Sorry, I read the book Other People's Money recently.
Yes.
It talks about that. And I can't remember the top bidder. Was it Tishman? They put in such little equity into the deal. It was crazy. It was a $5.4 billion purchase. They put like 100 million in it? I can't remember. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, they did borrow a lot of people's money, and the property went into special servicing, and ultimately the property came out of special servicing, reportedly to enormous profits for the people who ended up, bringing it out of special servicing, and the people who ended up owning it. I mean, look, it's an old saying, but timing in real estate matters. Yeah. And Tishman, who ended up losing that property, obviously was on the bad end of timing on that deal.
Did then Blackstone buy the debt then?
I think ultimately it was Blackstone. I don't actually remember, but I mean, somebody ultimately bought the debt and took it over.
That kind of leads nicely into another topic on mine is the rent stabilization laws changing in
2019 with the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act.
What's your gut feeling there going forward? We speak to our markets are very heavily stabilized. We deal with a lot of frustrated owners.
Yeah.
What's your gut tell you the future is there? Not you have a crystal ball.
I don't have a crystal ball. My gut tells me that rent stabilization in some form is here to stay in New York City. Occasionally people get the idea that maybe we can somehow convince a court, usually they're thinking of the Supreme Court in Washington, that rent stabilization is unconstitutional. That seems unlikely to me. It's been around for a long time. It's been tested real estate is an industry that has been regulated traditionally. I mean, for every rent stabilized apartment in New York City, there's somebody who also owns who says you can't change the zoning laws. I mean, the reality is that in New York City, property is heavily regulated. So, yes, I think it's going to stay around for a long time. The question is, how far will it go? One of the things that happened in this term is they, with the real estate compromise that was passed, I guess it was in April, that Governor Hochul managed to get through the legislature. It has a very watered down version of good cause eviction, which is in effect a way to bring rent stabilization, a kind of stabilization to tenants who don't otherwise have a rent stabilized apartment. It remains to be seen how that's actually going to play out in the economy and in the courts as to how much difference that is going to make.
Yeah. It'll be another interesting asset class to see how it evolves and what happens there.
Right. And there are a lot of implications. One of the persistent problems we hear about is the affordable housing crisis in New York City. Yeah. And the government's response usually is, we're going to create some regulations that will keep the market from totally dominating and driving what the rent prices should be. This is all obviously in the residential side. It doesn't apply to business or office leases, retail, that sort of thing. But, there are other ways to do that. One way would be to increase the supply. The government would like to do that. I think that's behind 485X. And it's behind some of these ideas to repurpose office buildings into residential. The hope is that by creating more supply, you'll create more downward pressure on rents. So far, it hasn't been successful, but it's early.
It's amazing how much policy can impact our business.
Oh, yeah. The real estate is a regulated industry. And, policy change is very important. In other jurisdictions, policy changes can have great impact. And what the real estate industry does there, they do it in New York too, but I'm thinking particularly in California, where this year there's a ballot initiative to effectively allow local governments to have the ability to enact rent control. And the California multifamily industry is mobilizing heavily against that. It is their feeling that while rent control sounds good to all the tenants out there, and there are always more tenants than there are owners in multifamily, so therefore more votes, if the tenants understood better what rent control could mean for them, they would not be in favor of that. I don't make my living predicting what people will do in a voting booth. I do make my living predicting what a judge might do with a dispute, so I'm more qualified to answer questions like that.
What do you think some of the solutions would be for, say, explaining to tenants why rent regulation or rent control may not necessarily be in their best interest? It seems like for a tenant, I get it, right? We all have bills to pay on the first of every month, so the short term thinking of like, I want my rent to be as low as possible, it seems like a lot of the time they're missing that may impact the quality of the building or the neighborhood that they live in.
Howard, you're in the solution business. Someone comes to you with a problem, and
right.
You have a solution to fix it.
Well, listen, if somebody came to me in my office with that, I would say, I know a number of people who work in public relations and in organizing political campaigns, and you should see them because they are experts. However, if you want my advice, and I won't charge you for it because I don't have a degree in it, so it's worth what you think it's worth. Look, it's complicated. You're right, Brian, to point out that, it's very easy to sell the idea that, I can't stomach a 10% increase in rent because now I'm talking about, choosing between groceries for my family or a roof over my head. That's a real problem. The longer view is you would want to try to explain to tenants that if we deregulated the environment a little bit while still keeping everything safe, perhaps there would be more supply, which would ultimately lead to the ordinary operation of supply and demand, where prices for housing would come down. There's no good reason that I can think of why housing in a place like Los Angeles, which has a lot of space, should be so much more expensive than housing in a place like Houston, which also has a lot of space. And one of the things that you can point to is the less regulated environment. Now, I don't want to come off as somebody who believes that there's no place for regulation in a modern economy, because I do believe that. One of the things that folks in Texas had to deal with was the electric industry was so deregulated that when they had cold snap, all of a sudden they were paying rates that skyrocketed. So that has to be balanced. That's why we have elections in this country, and we have politicians to make those decisions. My best advice is go make your best case. Try to keep it simple when you're talking to the voters, because look, I'm a voter. I work 40 hours a week. I've got a couple of young kids at home. I don't really want to spend my time figuring out all of these issues. I want to take care of my kids. I want to work my job so I don't get fired. And maybe I want to have a little bit of free time so I can enjoy myself on the weekend and watch television at night. That's a great way to live. There's a lot of people do that, and people don't have the time to really get into it the way people who live in the industry do.
Go to the beach in Connecticut.
Well, yeah, going to the beach in Connecticut is something that I'm going to hope to get to do this weekend.
Just lastly on this tenant stabilization, because I feel like we've beaten it to death over the last few years. But it seems like the means testing way is going in the right direction, right? If, like, say, for example, you're building a new building, old 421A or 485X means that you can set aside a percentage of the units that are put there for people earning a certain amount of income based on the average median income. That to me makes sense. But the idea that Howard Koh, or any other Howard Koh, I assume you're a successful guy living in New York City, could step into a rent-controlled apartment or a rent-stabilized apartment for $500 a month and expect the landlord to pay for it. I think that's where the real challenge is.
Yeah, means testing is probably a good idea.
Is it realistic?
It could be done. The question is always like, both God and the devil are always in the details, and it's how do you set it up to make sure this happens. And that's why you have these blanket rules that seem to apply and sometimes don't fit. We live in a city with a lot of people. There are a lot of complex situations. If we try to go for perfect justice in every one of these cases, we would spend so much time on each case that the system would collapse under its own weight. So you get rent-stabilized apartments, even though, when somebody rented it 20 years ago, the rent stabilization made sense. They've, had a change in career. They've become much more successful. They still get to maintain that apartment. That is an unfortunate byproduct of a system, but you're never going to have a system that's going to be totally free of those byproducts because it's just too hard and too expensive to go after all of these details. I wish we had the ability to do that, but my view is that, it's just too complicated. There are other problems everybody needs to tackle. People have to get on with their business, and that's the way it's going to turn out.
What's the least worst scenario? I guess that's what we seem to be jumping around to.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of these programs have made life better for a lot of New Yorkers, but there are, they aren't perfect.
Right.
And mean, one of the interesting things about living and working in New York is you have so many creative, talented people out here that they can put their energy into figuring out ways around the system. The last great example of that is the super tall tower. When some architect said, I can only build to 10 FAR, but nobody said I couldn't make one of those floors 80 feet high. And, there was a judge at the trial court level who said, no, that's clearly not what it meant. That's illegal. That got appealed to the appellate court. And the appellate court said, listen, there were developers relying on these regulations. They met the regulation. It's not fair at this point to make them cut off the top part of their building. We're going to allow this to happen. If the people are unhappy with that, they can elect a government that will change the regulation.
Interesting. Shifting gears a little bit, I'm curious some case studies that you like to potentially share, interesting stories. I'm thinking in my head an episode of Suits. Here's a subpoena, dramatic exit, and walk out the room.
Yeah, let me tell you something that you realize when you first grow up, which is life isn't like television. and the media sometimes inaccurately reports what actually goes on in a courtroom. Because having spent a lot of my life inside a courtroom, it's not always very dramatic. Most of the time, it's actually kind of boring.
That's disappointing.
Unfortunately, I hate to tell you, but proving that you own the building is a boring 2-minute exercise. But it has to happen. So interesting stories. One of the stories that I tell every once in a while is that, you get to a point where you can start to sense how things are going to play out before they actually happen. And roll your mind back to March 1st, 2020. Nobody had really focused on COVID. It was just coming into being in the media. It obviously had a big effect in China, but people were just beginning to get conscious of this. And I said to some of the people I work with, maybe we ought to look at these leases that we have, and they're what we call force majeure clauses, which says if there's an act of God, you may not have to.
We never heard of that before 2020.
Right, you may not have to actually honor your obligations in this lease. Because, this COVID thing, it might shut people down for a couple of weeks. That was the part where my prediction went haywire. But,
We're on the right track, but just...
I was on the right track, and that, I had the opportunity to get in early on what became a lot of litigation over, how COVID would ultimately impact the obligation to pay rent. Let's keep this separate between the commercial world and the residential world. The government, both the national government and the state governments, particularly at the time it was Governor Cuomo, made the decision that we're not going to put people out on the street in the middle of a pandemic. Not only is that somewhat heartless, but it's also bad public health. You want people alone and isolated. And we don't want a lot of people coming to court, so we had a period of about 2 to 3 months where courts basically were closed and inoperable. And we had to have executive orders delaying statute of limitations. But that led to a lot of litigation. And there were, on the residential side, there were programs to try to help people with rent. And the government did pass, many programs, most notably the PPP program, which got money to businesses so that they continued to pay their employees. And that had reverberations in the system. We can talk about that. But on the commercial side, we had to deal with the issue of, whether or not rent is going to be paid. And, the business owners were saying, and let's take a restaurant as a prime example, I can't operate my restaurant. People aren't coming in. Let's put aside the, food delivery industry, which, New York City did a great job of pivoting. They did a great job of allowing outdoor dining for that emergency. But there are other businesses that were just completely shut down. Your average, clothing store, for instance, couldn't do anything. They had to shift a lot to online. And, that became an issue. Well, when we looked at the leases, what we typically found in almost all of the cases is that the leases said, well, if an act of God happens, there are probably some things you have to do, but you always have to pay your rent. Now, why would that be? It's not just that the property owner was greedy. The property owner has obligations too. They have to pay taxes. They have to, if they own the property with a mortgage, they have to pay their mortgage company. And the reality is a lot of these, lenders insisted that, they get paid, and really, to the extent they have the ability to oversee the lease, they were insisting on that, on people putting that in their clause. So, we ended up with a lot of situations where you had tenants who just couldn't pay, and the owners had to work with those tenants to figure out solutions. Yeah. And you had situations where tenants were being opportunistic, where they had the ability to pay, but they thought that maybe they could get out of a lease that they no longer wanted, or maybe negotiate a better deal. And those cases had to play out. And for about 2.5 years after COVID hit, I was involved in litigating a number of those cases, and they played out in various different ways.
I know you do access agreements as well, and I can imagine access agreements is like a pure ego play. Like, why not? Like, why be difficult for the sake of it? But I can imagine you're dealing with these characters. And
This goes to whether people in New York City can be difficult as owners, and by access agreements, I assume you mean an access license agreement for construction.
Yeah, great, yeah.
Right. So, look, New York City, if you live here, you know this. Properties are right up against each other. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they share party walls, sometimes they don't. And party wall, I'm thinking of the technical term, is that it is a support structure for both buildings. Sometimes it's two walls next to each other. But a lot of times, if you need to make repairs or improve your property, you just can't walk on your neighbor's property. To do that, that would be trespass. Mm. So the way the industry handles this is they draft what's called an access license agreement. And that allows you to enter, the licensee, which is the person who wants to do the building, enter onto their neighbor's property. And, maybe they've got a roof that's, next to them, and your building is taller, and you need to repair that exterior wall. Well, the only way to do it is to go over their property. So you need an access license agreement, and the licensor, the person whose property is being gone over, wants to make sure that you have adequate safety, that you've properly put down roof protection. They may ask for a license fee.
It's good to be friends with your neighbor.
It is good to be friends with your neighbor, because sure as God made green apples, there's going to come a time where you're going to need some cooperation from your neighbors. So goodwill is always encouraged. There are times when it can't work, and at that point, if an agreement can't be made, there is a system in the New York statutes that allows you to go into court and say, I need access because I want to repair and improve my property, and my neighbor won't give it to me. So give me a judicial license to go do that and set the terms. And those cases are known as 881 for the statute that provides that. And those are regularly, not commonly, but regularly litigated in New York. And the reality is most of the judges, want to see these things worked out. They believe, for better or worse, that the policy of the state of New York is we want to certainly see new buildings get built. We also certainly want to see that old buildings are maintained properly. Every once in a while, a tragedy will happen where a piece of the building falls off and hits somebody, or somebody leans against a balcony railing and it falls over, and the law requires that you go through your facade safety and inspection program every few years. And in order to do that, sometimes you need access to your neighboring property. Those are the easier ones to get, because you can say to the judge, I got to make it safe. When you're doing a multi-million-dollar development, you may have less judicial sympathy, but ultimately, I think judges are sensitive to the fact that New York is always changing. I always say, if you don't like a building in New York, wait 5 years. They'll knock it down and build something else.
And
That's
the maximum they could pay, someone has to pay is $5,000 a month, is it, for a license agreement?
well. The answer is there's no legal maximum there, and I've seen agreements that contain much larger figures where the person who was doing the construction had their reasons to, want to make this go away quickly. Is that a windfall for the neighbors? Probably, but sometimes you get lucky. The question is, how much will a judge order? Most of the cases that are published, and I've litigated some of them, I've seen judges order $5,000 a month in certain cases. I've never seen anything higher than 15 in an order. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen anything higher than 10, but one of the guys I know who works in this area told me that he had once successfully gotten a $15,000 a month award. That is sometimes the price of being an owner, that you have to pay your neighbor in order to get the access.
But ultimately, you can't be held up indefinitely. Like, it will get to the point, if I bought the land and I'm trying to build, the neighbor is not going to stop me.
That would be very unusual if the neighbor would be able to stop you. Most of the way the law is currently written, you have the right on such terms as are just, which are the magic words in the statute, to have a license to do that access. Sure, if you make a mistake and something gets damaged on your neighbor's property, that's going to be on you. Mm-hmm. And, in all of these agreements, there are insurance requirements, and the courts require them too. Sometimes I've seen, escrow in addition to insurance. If, you can make the argument that I can't rent out my residential apartment with a terrace because you put something on top of it and decrease my value, you're probably going to get some kind of monthly compensation for that. But ultimately, you're probably going to be able to do your build. I've never, been in a situation where I felt it was smart to advise a client, don't close this deal because you're never going to get to do what you want with the property. In terms of construction. Now, if it's because, you've got 20 rent stabilized units and you're not going to be able to get the tenants out unless you pay them a big fee, that's a different problem. Mm-hmm. And maybe you don't want to close the deal on those issues. But if it's a construction related issue, it's usually not going to be an issue.
Sounds like a lot of fun and games there.
Right. I mean,
It's not for the money, right? This is not for the money.
I mean, what happens here is people get emotional about it.
Yeah.
And, I understand it. If I were the owner of a townhouse in the West Village and my neighboring people bought a townhouse and they wanted to do a lot of construction and that was going to interfere with my personal quality of life, I would be very upset, and I would want that construction to either not happen, and you probably can't prevent it from happening. But if it's going to be happen as quickly and as with the least amount of inconvenience to me as possible. Now, if your position is any kind of construction next to me is noisy and annoying, I mean, maybe you should be living in the suburbs. That's. When you come into New York City, look around. There are certain conditions about the lifestyle you want, and that's going to happen to everybody.
Sure.
I think that's all I've got. Unless you got anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a summer Friday, and you brought your beach hat. I know you're ready to hit the road. But how would in closing, how would somebody work with you, or what's the best way of getting in touch?
Well, that's a great question. And before I answer that, I've known Mitchell a little bit longer than you, Brian, but I think you guys are both great brokers. I know that Ripco is a terrific organization, and if you're looking for somebody to help you sell your property or acquire your property, you should definitely keep these guys at the top of your list. As far as I'm concerned, the way you reach me is that you Google me. You put in my name, Howard Koh, attorney. There is somebody else with the same name. He is a PhD and a medical doctor in Massachusetts. He works at Harvard. He's a very smart guy, but he probably can't help you with your legal
don't
problems.
call him.
Right. I'm the other guy who comes up in the Google. My law firm is Meister, Seelig and Fine. You'll get my email address, which is hsk@msf. That's Hotel Sierra Kilo at Mike Sierra Foxtrot hyphen LAW Lima Alpha Whiskey.com.
You've done that before.
I've done that before.
So easy to get in touch.
Well, yeah, I never had
just Google.
Just Google. I've never had the privilege of serving in the military. For one thing, I had bad eyesight. For another thing, there was no way my mother was going to let me do that. But at one point, I did try to memorize the NATO alphabet so I could do stuff like this, and people can say, "Oh, wow, he knows the NATO alphabet."
I love it.
Yeah, small things. But Google me. It'll have my phone number. Call and talk to me. I always take the first appointment without charging somebody for it, because it's important to make sure that lawyer and client have the right fit. I am a particular package, and I'm not necessarily the right lawyer for everybody, but I try to help as many people as I can.
Great. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, Howard.
Thank you.
It was great to be here, and I hope everybody enjoys the beautiful weather we seem to be having today.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thanks, Howard.
Thank you.